Hello, welcome back to another episode of the Jamie Files podcast. And so if you caught me last week or the week before that, I've been talking a lot about postmodernism, cyberpunk, the canceled future, and a lot of that stuff has been on my mind lately. And so I've been continuing the postmodernist study, and I've continued reading Simulation and Simulacra. I actually started reading this a long time ago, but I'm still not done with it. So I've been reading more of it lately. And it's relevant to talk about this book because The Matrix 4, the movie The Matrix Part 4, is actually coming out next month, I believe, in November. And the Matrix movies, the first one, the second, third, are based on a lot of concepts from this book, Simulation and Simulacra, by Jean Baudrillard. And so in this book, Simulation and Simulacra, it talks about how objects and how life, all of civilization and society has been transforming, and a lot of it is due to capitalism and how that changes the value structure, the value system, and it also changes the creative process, and it also changes our perception and vision of the future. So one of the things that it talks about in the book is that they're used in the further back in time you go, pre-industrial civilization, the gap between the real and the imagined was a lot broader, and it was distinct and it was clear, the boundaries between the real and the imaginary. When I say the imaginary, these are the imaginary realms, be it religious or visions of the future. So in a lot of parts of the world, pre-industrial, there was always the heavens and the afterlife and these other spiritual realms, even like celestial realms. So this was actually healthy, according to some philosophers, that this was actually healthy because it gives humanity hope. And they're always living and striving for a future. And so it gave humanity this sense of well-being, I suppose. I mean, I wasn't born pre-industrial civilization, so I wouldn't know whether that's better or worse. But so as industrialization is progressing and capitalism is advancing, the gap between the real and the imagined has shrunk. And according to the book, Simulation and Simulacra, it's at the point now where it's begun to converge and it's starting to blend. The problem with blending the real and the imaginary world is that now there's no vision of the future. Now there is no striving. So like I mentioned that pre-industrial civilization, these hopes of the future was oftentimes spiritual or religious, but then it became science fiction. And I talked about this on the last podcast, how in the 50s, 60s, 70s, science fiction was really positive, and the motifs that you would see in society involving the future were really positive, and then it started becoming dystopian and more fearful in the 80s and 90s, because when we actually hit the 21st century, we did not inherit this future that we were looking forward to in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So that's where you get the concept, the lost future, the canceled future. But so according to the book Simulation and Simulacra, the reason for not having, or if the reason for living in a canceled future and living in and not having a vision of the future is, yes, it's because of capitalism. And like I said in the previous episodes, that it speeds up production, profit becomes the driving force, not other values. And so all the other values get left behind, and we're only worried about profit. And that's so the creative process, the sublime, the beauty, all those things take a back seat, or they plateau because we just recycle. It's not that we don't have beauty and aesthetics and those type of things in this canceled future. We still do. It's all recycled stuff from the past. That's why they're specters from the past, recycled eras, 80s, 90s, and before. So yes, it's this gap between the real and the imaginary world that has disappeared. And so in the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, the one thing that's a little bit different about the book and Baudrillard's concepts in the movie is that in the movie The Matrix, the real world is on Nebuchadnezzar, the spaceship, or whatever you want to call it. It's like some ship, and it's in Zion, that place where they live, Zion. That's the real world. And in the book, though, okay, so wait, in the movie, the real world is Zion and Nebuchadnezzar, and when they're outside of the Matrix. Then when they jack into the Matrix, which is the false world, they're in the real world, or what to us is the real world. But the thing is, in the book, it's not presented the same way, because in the concept I just outlined, where the real world is Zion, and the fake world is the Matrix, there's still a clear distinction between the real world and the fake world. Whereas in this book, Baudrillard talks about the simulation and simulacra, and this world that we're living in, this postmodern world that we're living in. You cannot tell the difference between the real world and the imaginary world, which is actually worse. So in the Matrix, there's a clear distinction. There's still a clear distinction between which is the real world and which is the false world. So that's one, and they had to do that for Hollywood, because if it's got to make a little bit of, it's got to be watered down enough for the masses. And that's also another irony. It's kind of like Fight Club. Like, the movie Fight Club has a really similar message to The Matrix, in that it's capitalism. It's basically about capitalism and what it's done to society, and how it's pacified people, and a lot of like males too, into passive consumers, where we're just worried about lifestyle obsession. These are not even our own goals or our own thoughts, but it's like put out there by Fifth Avenue, and then we just follow it, buy into it, and live these inauthentic lives. It's the same thing. The Matrix, it shows a stark picture of a guy who's stuffing himself into a suit, goes to a cubicle every day, and just lives this monotonous life as a cog in the machine. Same thing with Fight Club. It's this pacification of the human spirit that they say that is the underlying message in both Fight Club and The Matrix. And so that is, simulation and simulacra. The difference between the real world and the imaginary has disappeared in this realm. And then it starts to also go into other concepts, such as spaces. Like, for example, spaces. When you think about cities, when you're walking around in different cities, mostly urban cities like Los Angeles, New York, and these kind of places, these are known as profane places. And whereas if you go back to pre-industrial society, a lot of the cities were designed in what they call sacred spaces. So sacred spaces is where there's an axis mundi, or there's a center point and something that orients the environment to the center, which in turn orients you to the self and yourself. So it always gives you a grounding, centering feeling being in these sacred spaces. But when you go out into the cities and the post-industrial cities, you'll see that a lot of the spaces are designed without any centralized orientation. There's no axis mundi. And so this can be disorienting, and it can take us away from being grounded from our center. And again, this is supposed to be another one of the underlying connections that we've lost, that advertising has sold back to us in the form of their products. This connection to yourself, which is source. And you got to remember that being connected to yourself is also being connected with others. So it's kind of a weird thing that when people, isolation is not bad, but anything can be bad or good. So isolation, when people are doing it for the wrong reasons, or not necessarily the wrong reasons, but they're doing it. Some people isolate because they don't feel connected to themselves, which in turn makes them not feel connected to others. So then they end up isolating, but when they're isolating, they're not actually even connecting with themselves. But then you have the other type of isolation, which is the good kind, which is you're doing it to connect with yourself, to ground yourself, and to recharge your batteries, and like the fortress of solitude, and to also hear your own voice, hear your own thoughts, like all those type of things. Like isolation is great for that. But there's also the unhealthy type, which I just mentioned. And so that's good to keep track of if you are isolating, why are you doing it? Or it's okay to do it either way, but just know that if you are feeling, you know how you could actually tell, so they say, is that if you feel lonely while you're isolating, then you're not actually connecting to yourself, you're not connecting to others, and you need to go find a sacred space to reorient yourself, to ground yourself, reconnect to yourself. But if you're just recharging your batteries, then that's great. So spaces is something else that has been, I guess, lost post-industrial society. And another one another thing the book talks about is furniture, living spaces. So Victorian homes, if you look at it, it's the ultimate show of trophies and fear of scarcity. So you'll see that it's all of the objects that go into a Victorian home. A lot of it are antiques. A lot of it are things that are from the past. And the reason for that is that it's kind of like being a master of time, or a master of, time is money. And so it's like being a master of time to have antiques, because they serve no function, but they serve an ideal. So a lot of the things that we consume are not actually functional, but we get them because they hold an ideal for us with absolutely no function. But this is something that actually was a byproduct, was something that happened later, post-industrial civilization, post-capitalism. This desire to own things for the ideal of it, not for the function of it. But then when we hit the 50s and capitalism in the 50s, then things become more minimalist, modern minimalism. This is where we get mid-century. So most of the furniture that you go and buy at the store nowadays is going to be designed, it's going to have that mid-century design, which is like 50s, 60s. And it's a minimal, efficient, functional design. It's designed for the purpose of being totally functional. So it's efficiency. And so that's the trend that's continued up until now. But it's interesting how much psychology and how much of studies in behavior plays into the economy and capitalism, and then how this designs the entire world around us. Everything. That's why, like in the Matrix, where he says the Matrix is all around you. It's everywhere. It's when you wake up and you go to work. I forgot the exact things that he says, but it's along those lines that the Matrix is everywhere that you go. And the reason why is because the Matrix is capitalism. So literally, the Matrix, if it's capitalism, is everywhere you go. It's literally the table that you're using, the chair that you're sitting on. It's all a product of capitalism, the design of it, the spirit of it, the ideal of the object is a product of capitalism. And then when you go out, the cities are designed that way. The people you're interacting with, we are all living in the capitalist system. So money, profits, we all have this bearing down on it. So you'll kind of see this in other movies too, where if you really look at the underlying factor of what is causing all the conflicts in this movie, in this story. Like, I saw this film, like, if you ever see a film where it's about someone who's in a financial debt, and that's the conflict, that's the main character's conflict, and then all the conflicts they get into with the other characters in the movie, you'll see that the underlying cause of most of all the characters' issues is money. And so a lot of postmodern philosophers feel that capitalism is this machine that has the system of capitalism is like this machine that has been created to imprison us, and we're making progress. We're always making progress because we're always making new products, but at the same time, we're not actually advancing. We're being held back because of debt. So part of this capitalist system is the credit system. So many people are in debt. Even if you buy a house, a mortgage, a car, and all these things, you go into debt, a lot of people, to get these things. So as more and more stuff comes out, it's the new version, it's the next model, it's the next series, and then you go get it. So you're advancing, but you're going into debt in order to advance. So you end up just staying where you are in place. So it's like this grinding wheel. The system is like this grinding machine that just grinds you down. It's like carrot and a stick. Chase the carrot and the stick, but you're just staying in place like a mouse on a wheel, or being on a treadmill. So this is all postmodern philosophy. So the other thing too is I mentioned serials, models, and this is another thing that the book talks about, is serial motivation. So serial motivation is that that's why, like, the Series 6, you got the Apple Watch Series 6, or the Model S, the Model T, and because it's called serial motivation, and humans seek relationships, and so when you sell things that come in a series, so like you can get the Apple Watch 6, and then you can get the different straps for it. And then you can get the different cases for it. You can get the new iPhone, and then you can get the new case for it. Or you get the iPad. You need to have the whole set. So you need the iPad, the iPhone, the MacBook, and the AirPods. And now that makes it complete. So that's serial motivation, and it gives you a sense of power. Each time you upgrade, each time you buy the next model or the next series, it gives you that sense of power. And it also completes your drive for relationships and to see the world through relationships. So the whole world is designed, has changed and shifted due to the change in the system. So it's real interesting to see how much of the human experience can actually change in ways that you wouldn't even know. So, like I mentioned earlier, I was born post the industrial civilization, so I don't even know what it would be like to not have money, like in Star Trek. And I mean, money was used long before the Industrial Revolution, but it wasn't the same form of capitalism. And I think it began with free trade, what they call free trade, which some people claim is freedom to exploit. But that's a whole other topic that we're not going to get into right now. So yeah, Simulation and Simulacra. This is a really good book, and there's so much in this book that I could talk about, and a lot of it has to do with advertising. But I'm going to be talking more about some of these things. And so why does this matter, and what does this have to do with? How does this plug in to the spiritual realm? Well, it has to do with time. It has to do a lot with time. So, like I mentioned, one of the things that they talk about, well, I didn't mention this yet, but one of the things they talk about in this book is how the wealthy will often, because of antiques, they're wanting to own something that has a historical value, that has a story, and you're basically buying a heritage when you buy an antique, and it has a historical lineage that is an ideal, that lives up to an ideal, but has no function. And whereas like poorer people tend to want to buy things that have functions because they need more power. They need to be able to live a life that works, get their life working. And so, but poor people also have the same, also according to these studies that advertisers conduct in these like market research studies, they also have the same desire to purchase things for ideals as well. So anything that comes from like the Western world or that is name brand has an appeal. So both wealthy and poor people have this same appeal for objects and the desire for consumption, and it's for the ideal. It's for that same ideal that is a non-functional ideal. And so this is a little off topic, but a viewer, Renaissance Ronin, he wanted me to talk a little bit about this. So I talked a little bit about altered states of consciousness last week and my experience with LSD and marijuana, and I haven't talked about some of the other things that I've experimented with, but I'm going to talk now a little bit about precognition and seeing the future, because this is another concept that you'll see in a lot of sci-fi and cyberpunk movies. It's always like this, it's always in the background, is that there still is like spiritual phenomenon and psychic phenomenon in that plays a factor in all this. And what is happening to the brains? What is happening to the psychic factors? And because we know what happens to behavior as society is advancing in the way that it is, but what is actually happening to our psychic factors? And so a lot of people think that if you go back to the deep time, the time before history, there were humans who did have psychic powers, telepathy, because telepathy is a much more richer and complete way of communicating. Language is actually an analog, it's actually a manual analog lower form of communication than telepathy is. If you can communicate telepathically, there's no need to explain anything, there's no way to lie, and when you receive the transmission, it's going to be a complete picture, if not totally accurate. I was going to say a quote from Simulation book, but it's going to get too confusing. But so telepathy. So this is telepathy. It's just a sense of knowing. And so if you're going to explain something, a set of instructions, like if you have some movers that are bringing in furniture to your house and you want them to set it at the back room and then take some stuff to the bedroom, you wouldn't have to explain to them, okay, when you get in the front door, watch your step, you're going to want to turn right, go down the hall. You wouldn't have to lay everything out in that linear sequence. It just arrives in the other person's mind as one complete package. So that's how telepathy would work. And there's a concept called future memories. It's actually a book, and I think the author, PMH Atwater, is responsible for coining this term, future memory. But a future memory is a little bit different than a deja vu. A deja vu is where you're going through a scenario and it feels like you've been through this before. A future memory is before something happens, you have a memory of this whole thing happening, and then when you go through the scenario, everything that you remembered happens. So you may be visiting an antique store or a gift shop, and right before you walk in, you kind of remember, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to go in here, I'm going to see a little elephant clock, I'm going to buy this elephant clock, the clerk is going to give me the wrong change, something specific like that. And then when you go through the situation, it actually happens. And if you read this book Future Memory by PMH Atwater, she talks about, she has a lot of cases, people writing in that they have this weird experience called future memories. So this bleeds into the past lives thing about the eternal recurrence. And are we living the same life over and over again for eternity? And is there life after death? There is actually a branch of philosophy called pessimism, which is all about what if not existing was actually better than existing. Because if you examine everything about existing, so much of it is pain. Whereas how would we know? We've never, so far, we don't have a living subject that has died and come back to life and has stayed, and then, or someone who has died, crossed over, and then stayed dead, and then stayed communicating with people in this realm. We've had people come back from the dead, but they don't stay dead. So we have no way of, psychics or mediums or people that can channel, some of them claim that they could talk to the dead, but as far as I know, we don't have any tangible evidence of that yet. And it's just, you kind of have to go with your gut or your intuition or your heart on whether you believe in channeling and those kinds of things. And I admit that I can't say for sure that those things are real, but I can't say for sure that those things aren't real, because what do we have to measure and detect whether it's real or not? We have the instruments of science, and maybe the current instruments that we're using wouldn't be able to encapsulate, wouldn't be able to detect something that's so out of this 5 sense perception of reality. And so we're looking with the wrong senses. It's like if you're trying to see something that cannot be seen with the sense of sight using the ocular design of a human eyeball, then that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but it means that you can't see it with your current instruments. And much of the universe is that. It has to be. If you think about how large the universe is, everything is possible. It's how and when will it become possible. So yes, psychic abilities, like, they are out there. They can be tapped into, but it's not something that is easily repeatable in a scientific setting. That's why the paranormal research in psychology and neuroscience, it's not focused on enough, because it's hard to reproduce these phenomenons. But don't give up. There are things, there's a whole bunch of knowledge that we don't know. Knowledge is getting destroyed all the time. And this is another thing they talk about in the Simulation and Simulacra, actually, is about how now I can't remember if it was in this book or not, but there's lost media. Lost media is that there's so much new media coming out that whatever just came out is going to be lost. And it could have been like the best thing ever, but people are going to forget about it as soon as the next new thing comes out. And then they're going to forget about that, and then they're going to forget about the next thing. And so things are very transient in this simulation and simulacra realm. Think about it. Even jobs, lives, all this is, you got to be willing to travel, willing to relocate, be flexible, freelance. All this is just, it's all very transient right now. So yeah, we're going to be talking about a lot of topics. We're going to go to the other side of the solar system and then to even other galaxies with this podcast. And we're just getting warmed up. This is episode 8, I believe, but many more to come. So don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.